Hey, what's up, everybody? Usually I don't do a, non-scripted intro, but this video probably is giving some of you deja vu. You're probably pretty confused, and basically this is what happened. I uploaded the video last Saturday. I'm kind of keeping on the schedule where I'm uploading every Saturday, and in order to do that, I definitely uploaded a video that I wasn't happy with. It was just kind of lazy. There was a lack of editing in general, and it was like a lot of gameplay when I'm talking about these serious real life events. And I just didn't like it, and I saw that, several of you didn't like it, and I just, after like, I think it was up for a day or two, I unlisted it. So that's why it's gone. This is the rework. It's completely reworked. All of the background footage is, different, and also there's a lot more like historical photos and stuff. I tried to make it better in general. The only other thing I'll say before this video starts is that I do have a TikTok page. I was going to announce it in the, usual Saturday video that still will be dropping tomorrow. But if you're watching this video, I have a TikTok page. I'm going to upload a bonus subject, a bonus like final image explanation to that, and on my Instagram today, like at the same time that this video comes out, and then it'll come out as a YouTube short tomorrow if you don't have either of those and you don't want to make one, just so, you guys can have a bonus thing for dealing with me having to remake this video because I just didn't want something like that, that bad of quality basically on my channel. But anyway, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and now let's get into it. Utah is a state known for its massive mountains and beautiful canyons. Millions of people visit the national parks there each year, and many love to explore their natural wonders. While this usually isn't very treacherous, this can unfortunately come with several dangers. Among them, one is more fatal than lightning, tornadoes, and even hurricanes. This being flash floods. These floods are sudden, and especially in the slot canyons of Utah, can be particularly life-threatening as the water will rush at very high speeds. Despite this, some people still love to hike in these slot canyons, and this leads us to our first image. This image was taken on the 18th of November 2015. In it, we see several hikers smiling in the famous Zion National Park as they prepare to enter a slot canyon. These hikers will be Mark McKenzie, Linda Arthur, Steve Arthur, Gary Favela, Muku Reynolds, Robin Brum, and Don Teichner. The aforementioned Zion Park is so famous, in fact, that 5 million or more people visit this park each year in order to gaze at all of the natural wonders within it. Keyhole Canyon is one of these natural wonders, and more specifically, the slot canyon that these hikers were going to be exploring. As you can see, this canyon and slot canyons like it are not for the faint of heart. For some though, such as those that practice canyoning, this is actually a place of enjoyment. Unfortunately though, canyons like this are the most deadly places to be when it comes to the aforementioned flash floods. This image of these hikers will be the final picture of all 7 of them. Every single one would pass away in a flash flood that would rip through Keyhole Canyon after a large rainstorm that occurred in the canyons in Hilldale, Utah and Colorado City, Arizona. Unfortunately, these storms would be so bad that the area where the hikers were was inaccessible by rangers. But that's not all. This flash flood was so bad that it would take the lives of 12 other people, including 9 children. Absolutely horrific, and a true message to be extremely careful if you ever practice canyoning in any of these slot canyons. In response to this, the governor of Utah at the time, Gary Herbert, stated, "I join other Utahns in mourning today the lives lost in 2 tragic incidents at Zion National Park and Hilldale. Jeanette and I send our thoughts and prayers to the families and friends of those who have lost loved ones. I thank the first responders, volunteers, and other officials involved in the recovery effort." This is the story of just one out of the 5 final images I'll be covering in this video today. With that being said, I hope you can enjoy this one, well, as much as you can anyway. And rest in peace to everybody mentioned. I'm sure many of us are extremely familiar with what an outbreak of disease is like. The times are always uncertain and for some people, deadly. One virus that is especially infamous is Ebola. Most people watching this video probably remember it from the outbreak in Western Africa that lasted from 2013 to 2016, but we'll need to go back around 37 years in order to tell this story. In 1976, Zaire, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo today, would experience the first outbreak of this virus. It would begin in Yambuku in the north. Mabako Lokela, a school headmaster, was patient zero. After returning to the village after a tour with a Yambuku mission in August that included going along the Ebola River, Lokela would fall ill. At first, it was presumed to be malaria. According to Wikipedia, he was given quinine for this, a medication commonly used to treat malaria. He would initially be admitted to the Yambuku Mission Hospital on the 1st of September with a high fever, but would be sent home with a recommendation of rest. Just 4 days later, on September 5th, he would be in critical condition. He presented symptoms such as profuse bleeding from all orifices, vomiting, acute diarrhea, chest pains, headache, fever, agitation, and confusion. He would unfortunately pass away on September 8th. After Lokela's passing, more and more people that had been in the mission hospital at the time became infected, with the World Health Organization saying almost all subsequent infections had either received injections at the hospital or had had close contact with another case. Many that came in direct contact with this man fell seriously ill, with the majority passing away. According to Wikipedia, of the friends and relatives that prepared his body for burial, 21 would fall ill and 18 of them would pass away. The mission hospital that Lokela was treated at was also remote and didn't have the right equipment to diagnose whatever this was. Eventually, as the cases continued to pile up, the Minister of Health would send out an international commission for further investigation. A few days later, the first doctor to arrive would state that none of the treatments used on the patients had been successful at all. This would also be the first official description of the disease. The International Commission team would continue to try to find out what exactly this disease was as they asked all of the nurses working with the patients to survey the patients. With basic info, they would be building a control group so that they could compare this information with the other Ebola patients. The desperation to figure out how this disease was spreading was mounting as people continued to be infected. Due to the uncertain nature of how this disease spread, they began to quarantine the most concerning region. This likely limited the amount of people losing their lives, despite some resistance from people not wanting to comply. As time would pass, it would later be found that the virus was mainly spread throughout the hospital due to some of the nurses at the hospital who would give pregnant women vitamin injections without properly sterilizing the needles. They would only wash the needles in warm water between uses and boil them when the day was over. In the end, 318 cases were identified, and out of those, 280 were fatal. This is an 88% mortality rate in this case. Another outbreak unrelated to the original would result in 284 sick and 151 of those passing away, a 53% mortality rate. The majority of the original mission hospital staff died, and multiple nurses that came to visit from other areas passed away as well. One nurse that would treat some of these patients was Mainga Nseka. She initially contracted the virus from treating a nun named Sister Fermina that flew in from the mission hospital that the virus began to spread in. Fermina would sadly pass away while trying to go back to Belgium in order for a formal diagnosis on the disease to be performed. This is an image of two nurses standing beside Mayinga as she's being treated for the virus. The reason she contracted the disease is because this was so early in the outbreak that people didn't understand how highly infectious and contagious it was. Nseka was only 22 and planning to travel to America to study advanced nursing and a scholarship at the time of her passing. May she and everyone lost in this outbreak rest in peace. According to Montana.edu, some of the most significant historical events in the US in 1978 would include US Senate proceedings being broadcast on radio, women being integrated into the regular army, homebrewing of beer becoming legal, and Jonestown. That deserves its own video though. Jonestown was not the only mass tragedy that happened that year either. On September 25th, 1978, Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182 would leave Sacramento for San Diego, traveling from Sacramento to Los Angeles first. According to Wikipedia, the crew consisted of 7 people. Captain James E. Jim McFerrin, First Officer Robert E. Bob Fox, Flight Engineer Martin J. Wayne, and 4 flight attendants. Each of the men named had over 10,000 hours individually. At 8:34 a.m., Flight 182 would leave Los Angeles with First Officer Robert E. Fox being the pilot. On the plane were 128 people in total, including 29 employees of Pacific Southwest Airlines. 25 minutes later, the crew would be notified by the approach controller about a small Cessna 172 aircraft that was flying nearby. Inside were 2 licensed pilots. According to Wikipedia, these were Martin Casey Jr., who possessed single-engine, multi-engine, and instrument flight ratings, as well as a commercial certificate and an instrument flight instructor certificate, and David Boswell, who possessed single-engine and multi-engine ratings, as well as a commercial certificate. Boswell at the time was training under Casey Jr. to get his instrument training. For those who may be confused, ratings are types of certifications you get when you complete a certain amount of training and testing on different types of aircrafts. Not long after being alerted, the pilots would report that they saw the Cessna 172, but in just moments, they would lose sight of it. This is a transcription of what was recorded in the cockpit. Is that the one we're looking at? Yeah, but I don't see him now. Okay, we had it there a minute ago. I think he's passed off to our right. As you can see, due to visual static, the tower received the message incorrectly, and because of this, thought that the pilots could still see the Cessna aircraft. Less than a minute later, Flight 182 would get permission to land. Are we clear of that Cessna? Supposed to be. I guess. I hope. Oh yeah, before we turned downwind, I saw him at about 1 o'clock. Probably behind us now. Unfortunately, this statement would be incorrect, as the plane was actually right in front of them, just too low to be in view. As Flight 182 descended, they moved closer and closer to the Cessna 172. Not only was the Cessna much lower, but due to its color it also blended in with the houses below, making it even more difficult to see. Strangely enough, the pilots of Flight 182 just never repeated that they had lost visibility to alert the tower just in case. According to Wikipedia, if the aircraft had maintained the heading or direction of the aircraft's nose at 70 degrees instead of 90, what happened next wouldn't have occurred. At 9:01 a.m., Flight 182 would come in contact with the Cessna at 2,600 feet. As this happened, people on the ground would hear a loud metallic crunching sound and an explosion before they looked up and saw this. This is an image of Flight 182 falling to the ground right after the crash that was taken by Hans Wendt. A video was also taken of the Cessna right after the crash by Steve Howell. Due to the right wing being heavily damaged, Flight 182 was completely impossible to control. On top of this, the fuel tank inside would rupture and catch fire. When looking at the transcriptions of what was said in the cockpit, we can see the crew realize that they've been hit and eventually accept that there's nothing they can do, with an unknown member saying, "Ma, I love ya," right before the plane likely crashes. Flight 182 would eventually hit a house, the driveway, and finally crash north of I-805, with one of the plane's wings lodging into another house. The plane would then explode, resulting in a giant mushroom cloud, and 60% of San Diego's fire department would be dispatched to the scene. The Cessna would crash in a different intersection. In the end, 144 people passed away, including the entire crew on both planes, and even 7 residents on the ground that were in their houses. This is the deadliest aviation disaster in California history, and the 6th deadliest in US history. Rest in peace to everyone that passed away in this unfortunate accident. This is an image of Sophie Lion, and as you can see, she looks emaciated and distraught. Over a year prior to this, she would move from a rural area northeast of Paris to London in order to work as a nanny for a couple named Sabrina Quader and Wissam Medouni. Unfortunately, this would be a horrific mistake, as the couple was particularly wicked. More specifically, Sabrina. She was known to be obsessive, to purport extreme false allegations of her exes, to harass them, and having extremely volatile behavior in general, including physical assault. One of these exes was a man named Mark Walton, who was one of the founding members of the Irish boy band Boyzone and a very successful person in the music industry. Sabrina was particularly obsessed with him, as she had always wanted to be rich and connected to society's elite. Because of how horrific she was as a partner, however, Mark would leave her after over a year of being together and moved to Los Angeles in order to avoid her. Sabrina took that personally, as she felt that Mark had stolen her chance to have the life she wanted. Unfortunately, this would continue to pervade her mind, as a young woman named Sophie Lion would read an ad that Sabrina had written in need of a nanny. Thinking it was a good choice, Lion would fly to the UK and begin to work for the couple, as I mentioned prior. Because of her deep obsession and delusions, Sabrina was absolutely convinced that Lion was being intimate with Walton, that she was a spy for him, and even worse. Countless videos were recorded by Sabrina, wherein, along with her partner, she tried to force Lion to confess to these allegations, even telling her that she would get her put in prison for 40 years if she wasn't honest. In some cases, she would even drag Lion to the police department. However, for some reason, they couldn't recognize that Lion was clearly in a bad situation. Unfortunately, Liane couldn't do anything about the horrific conditions she was being subjected to, and she couldn't afford to fly back to France. Eventually, she would call her mother and tell her that she was unhappy, and her mother would immediately tell her that she would pay for her flight back to Paris, making sure to book a flight for her. As things continued, Liane would be denied hospital treatment despite what she was experiencing. On September 20, 2017, neighbors would report a foul smell coming from a bonfire in the couple's backyard. Eventually, so many reports were filed that firefighters would respond to the scene and would be greeted by Maduni grilling chicken, a seemingly innocent task. Because of the smell, though, firefighters would put out the bonfire, and this is when the truth would be revealed. Among the charred remains, things like human fingers and a nose were spotted. Maduni would claim that this was a lamb carcass and nothing more. This would unsurprisingly not be believed. After burned glasses were discovered, the couple would subsequently be arrested on the scene. As police began to investigate, they revealed how horrifically Liane was treated, including having all of her items taken away. One of those items was the ticket her mom purchased her so that she could come home. They would constantly subject her to horrendous treatment, including a lot of physical mistreatment, starving her, attacking her, locking her in a dark room for hours, and constantly interrogating her about these delusional allegations mentioned earlier until she made a false confession. This wouldn't make things any better, with her life being taken in a bathtub in the house. Both would be sentenced to life with a minimum of 30 years. Rest in peace to Sophie Lion. Mitsuharu Misawa is highly regarded as one of the greatest pro wrestlers of all time. As a child, Mitsuharu was a huge fan of pro wrestling, with his favorites being German pro wrestler Horst Hoffmann and Japanese pro wrestler Tomomi Jumbo Tsuruta. By age 12, he wanted to pursue a career of pro wrestling. Initially, he wanted to go pro after completing junior high, but his mother and teacher would get him to focus on his studies so he could go to a school with a good wrestling program. His second year in high school, he would again want to drop out to pursue wrestling, but one of his idols, Jumbo Tsuruta, would tell him to complete all of high school and focus on amateur wrestling if he really wanted to go pro. This would lead to him wrestling in school, even winning the National High School Championship in 1980. He would also place 5th at the Freestyle World Championships that same year. According to Wikipedia, Mitsuharu actually disliked amateur wrestling despite all of his success at it. He would make his pro debut a year later and would lead an illustrious pro wrestling career, being an 8-time world champion, an 8-time world tag team champion, and finally winning the All Japan Pro Wrestling Triple Crown Heavyweight Championship and remaining the reigning champ for the longest period in that title's history. Due to business disagreements, he would eventually leave All Japan Pro Wrestling in 2000 and form a wrestling league called Noah. This league would be successful for the first 5 years, but as their top star Kobashi would have to leave for cancer treatment in 2006, Mitsuharu realized he would have to work a full-time wrestling schedule in order to maintain attention, despite his many injuries from his career. This would lead us to June 13, 2009. Mitsuharu would be participating in the GHC Tag Team Championships with Go Shiozaki against Akitoshi Saito and Bison Smith. 27 minutes into the match, Mitsuharu would take a belly-to-back suplex from Saito. After the suplex, Mitsuharu would lay there motionless. A doctor in attendance would rush in and attempt CPR, to no avail. Paramedics would then attempt to use a defibrillator, also to no avail. He would later be pronounced dead at age 46, with the cause of death being atlantoaxial dislocation. Japanese sports publications would cover this event heavily, however mainstream news would barely report on the matter. His private funeral would have 100 people in attendance, many of them being wrestlers. Rest in peace to a real legend. This image is one I'm sure some of you are familiar with. To give you some context, I'll have to take you back over 100 years to 1909. This is when the construction of the Titanic began. During the 26-month building process, over 200 injuries would be incurred by workers, with 6 people dying during construction. Definitely not a good omen for what would come in the future. When it was finished, the Titanic would boast things like a saltwater pool, a gymnasium, and even a Victorian-style Turkish bath. The allegedly unsinkable Titanic would finally be launched for the first time on May 31st, 1911 at 12:12 p.m. Almost 1 year later, on April 10, 1912, the ship would leave on its maiden voyage with 920 passengers aboard, not including the crew. It would narrowly avoid a collision with the SS City of New York in the Oceanic and then successfully make its way across the Atlantic to Cherbourg in France. There it would pick up 274 passengers and let off 24. They would then head to Ireland by April 11th and arrive at Cork Harbor, picking up 123 more passengers and letting off 7. One of the passengers that disembarked the voyage, Kate Odell, would take the photo that you've already seen. On April 13th, the Titanic began to head back across the Atlantic in order to return back to New York by April 17th. During this time, a fire was noticed on the ship that had apparently been burning for some time, which wasn't necessarily uncommon for steamships at the time. According to Wikipedia, this is because of the spontaneous combustion of the coal that they would use to fuel the ships. As they would continue to make their way across the Atlantic, the Titanic would begin to get several warnings from other ships talking about drifting ice, but this was ignored by the captain Edward John Smith, as this was commonly taken as more of an advisory. On top of this, no vessel had ever been capsized by ice before, and any head-on collisions that did happen didn't end in tragedy. Unfortunately, at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, an iceberg would be spotted ahead of the Titanic, who was moving at full speed. Although the first officer of the ship, William Murdoch, attempted to instruct the ship to avoid the iceberg, it was already too late. After slamming into the iceberg on the starboard side, the hull or body of the ship would be dented in such a way that the structural integrity would be compromised, causing water to be able to rush through the formerly watertight compartments. Out of the 2,223 people on the ship, only half could be put onto lifeboats, as the ship was considered virtually unsinkable and therefore didn't really require lifeboats. Women and children were rushed onto the lifeboats first, which drastically helped the survival rate of those groups. By 2:20 a.m., the ship was on its way into the depths of the ocean. In the darkness, in water that was below freezing temperature, many people struggled to survive. Out of those, only 5 were helped into lifeboats, despite there being a capacity for 500 more people. It would take until 4 a.m. for another boat to come onto the scene, this being the RMS Carpathia. After everything was said and done, 1,517 people died, with only 706 making it back to New York. Rest in peace to everyone lost in this tragedy.